On the night of April 14th, 1912, the most famous ship in history sailed through the freezing Atlantic Ocean beneath a sky filled with stars. The RMS Titanic was considered the greatest ship humanity had ever created. Newspapers called it unsinkable. Passengers believed they were traveling aboard the safest vessel on Earth. The giant ship carried wealthy businessmen, immigrants, families, workers, musicians, and travelers from many different countries. For some passengers, the voyage represented luxury and adventure. For others, it represented hope and a chance to begin a completely new life in America. The Titanic itself looked more like a floating palace than an ordinary ship. Its elegant halls glowed with golden lights during the cold nights of the journey. Massive staircases, expensive restaurants, smoking rooms, and luxurious cabins impressed everyone on board. Even experienced sailors admired the enormous vessel crossing the Atlantic. The engines of the Titanic pushed the ship powerfully through the freezing ocean waters. Everywhere on board, people laughed, celebrated, danced, and enjoyed the historic voyage. The atmosphere during the first days of the trip felt calm and completely safe. Children played through the corridors, while wealthy passengers enjoyed elegant dinners at night. Musicians performed beautiful songs, while guests talked about the future. Far away from land, the Titanic continued crossing the dark Atlantic Ocean beneath freezing winds. Most people on board could not imagine that disaster was already approaching through the darkness ahead. Earlier that day, several nearby ships had already warned the Titanic about dangerous icebergs floating across the Atlantic route. Large ice fields had formed in the freezing waters ahead. Even so, the Titanic continued moving at extremely high speed during the night. The crew believed the giant vessel could survive almost anything. Many people on board trusted the ship completely. Nobody wanted to believe something could destroy a vessel that enormous. Late that night, the temperature dropped even further. The sea became strangely calm beneath the moonlight. Crew members standing high above the ship searched the darkness for danger using only their eyes. The freezing wind crossed the upper deck while the Titanic moved deeper into the Atlantic. Then suddenly, something appeared directly ahead of the ship. A gigantic iceberg emerged from the darkness only seconds away from disaster. The crew reacted immediately. Orders were shouted through the freezing night, while sailors desperately tried turning the vessel. But the Titanic was simply too massive to avoid the collision completely. The side of the ship scraped violently against the giant wall of ice. A terrible vibration traveled through the enormous vessel. At first, many passengers barely noticed the impact. Some people even joked about the strange movement beneath their feet. Others continued eating, talking, and listening to music, without understanding the danger. But deep below the surface of the ocean, freezing water had already begun flooding the ship. Several compartments rapidly started filling with deadly Atlantic seawater. Engineers rushed through the lower sections of the vessel while trying to understand the damage. Very quickly, the horrifying truth became impossible to ignore. The Titanic was sinking. Captain Edward Smith received devastating news from the engineers on board. The damage was too severe. The ship would not survive the night. Even after hearing the truth, many passengers still refused to believe the danger. The Titanic looked too beautiful and too powerful to disappear beneath the ocean. But the freezing water continued rising through the lower decks. Crew members began uncovering lifeboats, while confusion slowly spread throughout the ship. At first, many passengers treated the situation like a simple precaution. Some people refused to leave the warmth and safety of the Titanic. Others laughed nervously while stepping into the lifeboats. But the situation quickly became far more terrifying. Cold ocean wind crossed the decks as panic slowly began spreading among the passengers. Crew members shouted instructions while families searched desperately for loved ones. Children cried, while frightened passengers gathered near the lifeboats. The musicians on board continued performing music even as chaos approached. Their songs echoed across the freezing Atlantic during the disaster. Meanwhile, Seawater continued flooding deeper into the ship. The front of the Titanic slowly began sinking lower into the ocean. Passengers now realized the nightmare was real. People started running through the corridors, trying desperately to survive. Luxury rooms that once symbolized wealth and elegance now filled with freezing seawater. Massive hallways transformed into terrifying flooded tunnels. Some passengers became trapped behind locked gates and crowded staircases. Others desperately searched for a way onto the lifeboats. Lifeboats were lowered into the freezing darkness, while terrified passengers begged for space. Shockingly, some boats left only partially full, while hundreds of people remained on board. The freezing Atlantic below looked endless and merciless beneath the night sky. As the ship tilted further into the ocean, panic completely consumed the remaining passengers. Furniture, luggage, and debris slid violently across the decks. People clung desperately to railings while the enormous vessel groaned under unbearable pressure. The lights of the Titanic still glowed against the darkness of the ocean. Then suddenly, the impossible happened. The giant ship began breaking apart in the middle of the Atlantic. A horrifying roar echoed through the freezing night as metal twisted violently. Passengers screamed while the Titanic split into pieces above the black ocean. Moments later, the enormous vessel disappeared beneath the freezing Atlantic forever. Hundreds of people were thrown directly into the deadly water. The temperature of the Atlantic Ocean killed victims within only minutes. Desperate cries for help echoed through the darkness after the sinking. Survivors inside the lifeboats listened helplessly as the freezing ocean claimed more lives. The night became filled with fear, silence, and death. Far away from land, the survivors floated alone in darkness, surrounded by ice. Hours later, rescue ships finally arrived at the disaster site. Only a fraction of the passengers survived the freezing night. More than 1,500 people died in one of the deadliest maritime disasters in history. The sinking of the Titanic shocked the entire world. Newspapers everywhere reported the impossible destruction of the unsinkable ship. For decades, the disaster became one of the most famous tragedies ever recorded. Many survivors carried the trauma of that night for the rest of their lives. Some described hearing the screams from the ocean long after the tragedy ended. Others refused to speak publicly about the disaster ever again. Even more than 100 years later, the story of the Titanic continues haunting people around the world. Deep beneath the Atlantic Ocean, the remains of the ship still rest in darkness.